We have all heard about the Cold War, the United States, the Soviet Union, the nuclear arms race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the Berlin Wall. But what was the Cold War really? How can a war be cold? When we think of war, we imagine tanks, aircraft, and soldiers fighting on the battlefield. But for nearly 50 years, the two most powerful nations on Earth waged a war without ever fighting each other directly. And yet, the entire world lived under the constant fear of a conflict that could destroy humanity. How did two allies who had fought side by side to defeat Nazi Germany become the world's most bitter enemies? And why were millions of people convinced that a nuclear war could break out at any moment? To answer those questions, we need to go back to the very end of World War II. The year is 1945. World War II is finally coming to an end. Nazi Germany has been defeated. Japan has surrendered. And after 6 years of devastating war, it seemed that the world was about to enter a new era of peace. But behind the celebrations and the victory, a new conflict was already beginning to emerge. Despite being allies, they had never truly trusted one another. In reality, they represented two completely different visions for the future of the world. On one side stood the United States, which believed in democracy, free markets, and capitalism. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, which championed communism, a state-controlled economy, and the expansion of its ideology beyond its borders. Each side was convinced that its system represented the future of humanity. And once their common enemy had disappeared, the differences between them became impossible to ignore. Almost immediately after the end of World War II, a rivalry began to take shape, one that would shape the world for decades to come. With the end of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities had been destroyed, millions of people had been killed, and economies across Europe had collapsed. It seemed that peace had finally arrived. But while the nations of Europe struggled to rebuild, the two allies who had defeated Nazi Germany were already beginning to move in very different directions. The Soviet army had pushed Nazi Germany out of large parts of Eastern Europe. But when the war ended, it didn't leave. Instead, it remained across the region and helped establish communist governments loyal to Moscow. At the same time, the United States strengthened its ties with Western Europe, supported democratic governments, and helped rebuild the region's shattered economies. Before long, the division had become so obvious that one of the world's most famous leaders decided to give it a name. In 1946, Winston Churchill described the situation with a phrase that would become one of the defining symbols of the Cold War. An iron curtain has descended across Europe. The United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly. But that was exactly what made the situation even more dangerous. Instead of fighting on the battlefield, the two superpowers entered an unprecedented arms race, centered around the most destructive weapon the world had ever seen. In 1945, the United States was the only country in the world that possessed nuclear weapons. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the devastating power of this new weapon to the world. But that advantage would not last for long. Just 4 years later, the Soviet Union successfully developed its own nuclear weapon. From that moment, an unprecedented arms race erupted between the world's two superpowers. Every time the United States developed a more powerful weapon, the Soviet Union raced to match it. The arms race had become a never-ending cycle of competition. Before long, the competition extended far beyond atomic weapons. Both superpowers developed hydrogen bombs, many times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The race was no longer just about building more weapons. It was about developing the ability to launch them anywhere in the world. Within just a few years, both superpowers had accumulated thousands of nuclear warheads. The United States and the Soviet Union now possessed enough destructive power to annihilate each other many times over, and potentially bring an end to human civilization itself. A situation emerged in which any nuclear attack would almost certainly trigger an equally devastating retaliation. This concept became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Unable to risk a direct war, the two superpowers turned to other methods of competition, battling for influence, allies, and power across the world. One of the first places where the rivalry between the two superpowers turned into a military conflict was on the Korean Peninsula. After World War II, Korea was divided into two spheres of influence. In the north, a communist regime was established with the support of the Soviet Union. In the South, a separate state emerged with the backing of the United States. On June 25, 1950, the tension finally boiled over. North Korea invaded the South in an attempt to unite the entire peninsula under communist rule. What began as a local war quickly escalated into an international conflict. The United States and several other nations came to the aid of South Korea, while China and the Soviet Union backed the North. The Korean peninsula became one of the first and deadliest battlefields of the Cold War. Entire cities were destroyed, millions of civilians were forced to flee their homes, and the war claimed the lives of millions of people. After 3 years of brutal fighting, the war ended without a clear winner. Korea remained divided into two separate states, North Korea and South Korea, a division that remains in place to this very day. But beyond the destruction and the staggering death toll, the Korean War proved that the Cold War would not remain merely a political or ideological struggle. From this point forward, the two superpowers were willing to fight each other indirectly, even if the cost was millions of lives. Over the years that followed, tensions between the two superpowers continued to rise, and the nuclear arms race became more and more dangerous. Then in 1962 came the moment when the entire world stood on the brink of disaster, an event that many still consider the moment humanity came closest to nuclear war. American spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba, a small island located less than 150 kilometers from the coast of the United States. For the Americans, this was an unprecedented threat. For the first time in history, Soviet nuclear missiles were capable of striking major American cities within minutes. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba and demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles. For days, the world watched anxiously as American and Soviet warships moved closer and closer to one another, and the tension continued to grow. For many tense moments, it seemed that nuclear war was inevitable. In the end, after secret negotiations between Washington and Moscow, a compromise was finally reached. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States pledged not to invade the island, and secretly removed American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without a war, but it revealed just how dangerous the Cold War had become. Never before had the world come so close to a nuclear confrontation between the two superpowers. In the aftermath of the crisis, both superpowers began taking steps to reduce the risk of a direct conflict. A direct communication line was established between Washington and Moscow, allowing the leaders of both nations to communicate quickly during a crisis and avoid a dangerous escalation. But although the world had managed to avoid a nuclear war, the Cold War was far from over. The United States and the Soviet Union continued to compete for influence across the globe, and in one place, this struggle was about to become one of the longest and deadliest conflicts of the entire Cold War. Vietnam was divided into two separate states. In the north, a communist government was established with the support of the Soviet Union and China, while in the south, the government was backed by the United States. As communist influence in the region continued to grow, the United States decided to increase its involvement and send hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam. But despite its overwhelming military power, the United States struggled to win the war. The fighting took place in dense jungles against guerrilla fighters who knew the terrain extremely well and relied on tunnels, ambushes, and deadly traps. The war dragged on for years, claiming the lives of millions of people, while countless cities and villages were left completely destroyed. After years of brutal fighting, American forces withdrew from Vietnam. In 1975, the country was officially reunified under communist rule. The Vietnam War became one of the defining examples of the Cold War, a war fought not through direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, but through devastating proxy wars across the world. But the Cold War was not fought only on the battlefield. While armies fought across the world, another battle was unfolding, one that was far quieter but just as important. This time, the battlefield was not on Earth, but in space. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in human history. For the United States, this was far more than just a scientific achievement. If the Soviets were capable of launching a satellite into space, then they were also capable of launching a nuclear missile to any point on Earth. 4 years later, the Soviet Union achieved another historic milestone. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person in human history to travel into space. The United States did not fall behind. After years of massive investment, it successfully landed Apollo 11 on the moon in 1969. The space race became one of the defining symbols of the Cold War. It was a competition that was not just about science. but also about prestige, technology, and proving which of the two superpowers was the true leader of the world. But even after the space race, the rivalry between the two superpowers was far from over. By the late 1970s, another region of the world had become a new battleground of the Cold War. In 1978, a communist coup took place in Afghanistan, bringing a new communist government to power. But within months, the new regime was facing uprisings across the country. To prevent its collapse and preserve its influence in the region, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. What was supposed to be a quick military operation soon turned into a long and brutal war. The Soviet army found itself fighting the Mujahideen, who were supplied with weapons, funding and training from the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and several other countries. For nearly 10 years, Soviet forces fought across the rugged mountains of Afghanistan. But despite their military strength, they failed to defeat the insurgents. The war claimed the lives of thousands of Soviet soldiers, cost the Soviet Union billions, and severely damaged its standing on the world stage. For many historians, it became known as the Soviet Union's own Vietnam, and one of the key factors that accelerated its decline throughout the 1980s. But Afghanistan was only part of the problem. For decades, the Soviet Union poured enormous resources into the nuclear arms race, the space program, and supporting communist regimes around the world. But as the years went by, the massive cost became harder and harder to sustain. Shortages of everyday goods became increasingly common, living standards continued to decline, and the crisis inside the Soviet Union grew deeper. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He knew the Soviet Union was facing a deep crisis and tried to save it through a series of reforms, designed to open up the economy and give people greater freedom. But instead of saving the Soviet Union, the reforms exposed problems that had been building for decades. More and more countries across the Eastern Bloc began demanding independence, and the Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe slowly began to weaken. Then, in 1989, an event took place that would become one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War's end. After World War II, Germany was divided into two separate countries. Over the years, millions of people fled from East Germany to the West, searching for greater freedom and a better quality of life. To stop the mass exodus, in 1961, the East German government built the Berlin Wall, a massive concrete barrier that split the city in two and became one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War. But by the late 1980s, the communist regime was beginning to weaken. As protests grew larger and louder, public pressure reached a breaking point. On November 9, 1989, the East German government announced that travel restrictions would be eased. But after confusion over the official announcement, thousands of people rushed to the Berlin Wall. The border guards, who had received no clear orders, opened the checkpoints. Within hours, crowds began crossing into West Berlin, and people climbed onto the wall, tearing it down with their own hands. The fall of the Berlin Wall meant far more than the destruction of a concrete barrier. For millions of people around the world, it marked the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the beginning of the end of communist rule across Eastern Europe. Less than 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union itself came to an end. On December 26, 1991, it officially dissolved into 15 independent countries, bringing the Cold War, after nearly 50 years, to an end. The Cold War officially ended in 1991, but the world it created still exists today. The alliances, the borders, the conflicts, and the balance of power shaped during that era continue to influence global politics even now. The history of the Cold War may be over, but its legacy is far from over. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Videos like this take dozens of hours to research, write, and edit. So if you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like me to cover next.